In this video, we're going to consider the different strategies used by plants to reproduce. And you'll see from this image that plants have been evolving for a very long time. So pause this video and take a moment to think about what you can see, what you can think, and what you can wonder about this image. So let's see if you noticed that there is a changing dependence on water. Very early types of plants were based in the water, and they were green algae. And then as land plants evolved and we have mosses and then ferns, they became less dependent on water than being in the water, but they still need to be in very moist environments. The fern has got xylem and phloem developing. That's what early vascular plants means. They had xylem and phloem, and they now are able to transport water up their stems, so they are less dependent on water than a moss, which is very small and has to be in the water. And then we have plants that produce seeds, so the gymnosperms and the angiosperms produce seeds, whereas the plants before them, so the mosses and the ferns, they were producing spores as their reproductive structures. And we have two different types of seeds going on. We have seeds from cones, that's the gymnosperms, they're your conifers and your pine trees, and seeds from flowers. So let's have a look at what we can look at next. We've got flowers here. I've got on the left a classic flower with pretty petals. It's probably got a nice smell and nectar. And on the right, a slightly more boring flower, because you probably didn't even notice that grasses had flowers, but they do, and you can see some of the same structures on them. So if we are looking at seeds coming from flowers, we're looking at flowering plants, and flowering plants are called angiosperms. That is the correct term for flowering plants. And all flowering plants use meiosis to make ova or eggs, and they use meiosis to make pollen. So that means that we have a large amount of genetic variation in the flowering plants and in the seeds that they make. These plants are different in the way they attract pollinators to move the pollen from the male area of the plant, which is the stamen here, and the anther makes the pollen, to the carpel, where the female bits are, which starts off at the top with the stigma, and then you have the style, and the ovaries where the eggs are. So you need pollinators to move the pollen from one part of the plant to another. On the left, you've got a plant which has pretty petals, nectar, and scent. So pollinators like bees or some mammals or birds might come and pollinate. But over on the right, the grass one, the reason why it's not so pretty is it's wind pollinated. So you can see some of the anthers with their pollen on hanging out at the plant, so they're exposed to the wind, and the stigma hanging out of the flower, so that any wind-borne pollen lands on it, and then it's pollinated. Let's have a look what happens when pollen does land on a stigma. So at the top here, we've got to remember that pollen grains, they don't swim like a sperm. They are not motile, they can't move, but they can grow. So when a pollen grain lands on a stigma, you can see that a pollen tube is growing down towards where the ovum is. So the haploid pollen is able to meet the haploid ovum. Remember, they were both made by meiosis, so they are haploid. You've got just one set of each chromosome, and that happens down in the ovary. And when these two meet each other, they fertilize, they join together, and we have some genetically variable offspring because of the joining of a pollen and an ovum together. And the pollen and the ovum together make a seed, and that seed will then develop inside a fruit. Now, here we have a different type of plant. Here we have seeds coming from cones, and the correct word for that is a gymnosperm. And this particular gymnosperm is a native to Australia. It's the native white cypress pine, and you can see the distribution of where it's found. There are two different types of cone, male cones that make pollen and female cones which receive the pollen and where the seed will grow. And you can see down the picture at the bottom of pine trees or conifers or gymnosperms releasing pollen that they release a really large amount of light pollen, and that pollen is wind carried from one cone to the other as it's pollinated. Moving to a slightly more primitive plant, here we're going to consider the reproductive strategies of ferns and mosses. Now, ferns and mosses go through something called alternation of generations. In other words, they have a period of time where they are haploid, and that's the green area across the top here, and a period of time when they are diploid around the bottom. But what's key here is there are no flowers. This is before flowers have been invented, before seeds have been evolved, and before seeds have been evolved. And you can see up the top here that they are going to reproduce using spores. So there is the mature plant, like we'll see in class. It has spores on the bottom, held inside a capsule called a sporangium, and the sporangium undergoes meiosis, and the spores that are produced within it are haploid, and when that young spore germinates, it makes a haploid little leaf-like structure that is able to generate sperm and eggs that fuse together, bringing two haploids together to make a diploid individual that grows into a big fern plant that we imagine as a fern. And this is a similar thing that happens with moss as well. This part of its time as a haploid plant and part of its time as a diploid plant, the alternation of generations.